Good evening, everyone. We continue our study today in Second Samuel chapter 5. Reading from verse 1. I think the first word here we need to pay attention is this is an and then. What it tells us is that when we left off yesterday at the end of chapter 4, where Ishbosheth's head was buried together with uh, Avner in Hebron, we now take a, another view of the narrative, and we don't know how many years have passed, but it is a different narrative in chapter 5. Now, one of the things that we should be aware of is that these narratives, even though it says and then, or it may be one after another, it doesn't have to be immediately after one another. What it essentially tells us is that this particular narrative in chapter 5 is is happening after chapter 4, but how many years after, we really don't know. And so now we begin to read chapter 5, verse 1, and it says, um, all the tribes, all the tribes of Israel. Now, all the tribes here, I suppose you can say that this would be, well, I suppose you can say that these are all 12 tribes. All 12 tribes. Given the context, it is actually telling us that there was a period of time. Right? There's a period of time where it wasn't all the 12 tribes, but at this point in time, there are 12 tribes that came to see David at Hebron. And they said, right, in Hebron, they said this, behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Now, please take note of this statement, the idea of your bone and your flesh. We would be all the tribes of Israel. Person that they're talking to, David. On location, Hebron. There is no Jerusalem at this point in time. Right? There's no Jerusalem at this point in time. Now, the interesting thing about this phrase, we are your bone and your flesh, really gives us a glimpse of how the Hebrew speaks. We read in Genesis chapter 2 when the woman was brought to the man, and he says, you are the flesh of my flesh, the bone of my bone, because the woman was taken out from the rib of a man. Now, that concept of bone and flesh is very oriental. And so, bone and flesh basically say that we are all very well connected or related. And it is not just very well, we are very intimately. And by this, it says that whatever you say, we will do. So, this is the picture of bone and flesh. The children of Israel, all the tribes of Israel are saying this, David, we are your bone and your flesh. You are the head, right? You are the head. And here we are, the all tribes. And the picture that it's trying to be painting is that, yes, David's going to be the head, he's going to be the king. And we are all going to be his body, that part of the body. And it's described as your bone and your flesh, which means that whatever you do, we will Whatever you say, we will do. When you feel pain, so will we. And it means that they are now going to be in a very tight relationship. Now, they are different tribes, and David is king of Judah. Now, all of them come together and they are in unison to make David the king in a commitment, or a very Hebrew commitment, that describes themselves as bone and flesh. We are your flesh, we are your bone. When you cut yourself, we will hurt because we are your flesh and bone. Now, that would be the picture in verse 1. Now, this word previously, it is a very interesting way that is being described. The word previously is even yesterday, even the day before yesterday. That is this is the literal reading of this word previously. And so it's trying to paint a picture that these people say, before this, way before this, before we came to you, there was Saul who was king over us. But you were the one who led Israel, all the going out and all the coming in. What does this mean? It means that this is about leading the troops. So David was the warrior chief, while Saul was king. And the Lord said to you, now this is something that they seem to know, that God had anointed David. And the phrase is this. It says, you will shepherd my people, Israel, and you will be a leader over Israel. And so let me just put here as an A and a B. So two phrases or two expressions, which they are talking about the same thing. All right. And so this word here, shepherd my people, I would point you to Psalm 23, verse 1. The shepherd in this case, as you can tell, the shepherd is the leader. The shepherd takes care of the sheep. So my people is symbolizing the sheep, Israel. Now, if you are a leader over Israel, you will also take care of the people. One is a shepherd illustration, one is a political illustration. But both speaks about the same thing, because God always referred to the king as a shepherd, not as a tyrant, not as an autocratic king. The king always listens to God and follows the Torah of God to take care of the people of God. And that would be how the king fits into the entire organization of God. And so you will shepherd my people, essentially is telling him that you will be a leader over Israel. In verse 3, it tells us that all the elders, now these are the older and they are leaders, right? They are older and they are leaders. That's what elders mean in the Hebrew. Elders doesn't mean a leader, even though he's a young kid, right? In Hebrew, only the older people are deserving a leadership position, because they have gone through life and seen it, and through their wisdom, the people then decide to appoint some of these older people as elders of Israel, and they would be elders of the 12 tribes. Came to the king at Hebron, that's where David is. And King David, now this is very interesting because very rarely we call him King David. And this is one of those times. We always see his name as David, but here we says King David. King David cut. The word made is cut. Cut a covenant with them before the Lord in Hebron. Before the Lord, literally says to the face. All right. To the face of the Lord in heaven, meaning it's in plain sight and God will be their witness. And then they anointed David king over Israel, and he is the Mashiach. Now, just scroll backwards a little bit. First, we have Avner, and he anointed Ishbosheth. And we're told Ishbosheth in chapter 2 and in verse 10, 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. Ishbosheth was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, which is the northern territories. And he reigned only for 2 years. Only the house of Judah followed David. Now, this is important because we need to deal with some challenges here. And so now we have this. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. So we need to understand that when he became king, he was 30 years old. And when he finished, he was 70 years old. How long did he reign? 40 years. From which time? From the time in Hebron, which is still now, right? From the time of Hebron. Let us just wrap up this section. It says, at Hebron, he reigned over Judah for 7 years, 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned for 33 years over all Israel and Judah. So now we have all Israel anointed David. And David reigned in Hebron 7.5 years. And then in Jerusalem, 33 years. Now, so we have a few things to talk about, because while Ishbosheth was, I would say, what was made king by Avner, then we have here David started in Hebron. And this is what it means. When it was in Hebron, David started to reign over Judah. Now, this word over is on account of. Right? That is a meaning there that we can work with. On account of. Now, in chapter 5, verse 5, we need to now peel back the Hebrew a little bit. The word over, on account of, according to, in addition to, or together with, or over, then it's there. On the ground of. These are all good words. Basically, what we're saying is that he reigned because of Judah. Right? He reigned because of Judah. That is here. He is 30 years old when he first started. I think that's all we are saying. And he reigned here for 7 years and 6 months, 7.5 years. It is important that then we realize that sometime here, uh, possibly after the 2 years, is where we have Second Samuel chapter 5, right? In verse 1. And and all of them wanted to make David king over all Israel. So I would suggest that because the text here doesn't specifically say that it included Israel while David was king in Hebron, but we do know that in verse 3, when all Israel, all 12 tribes came to see David, it was still in Hebron. It was not yet in Jerusalem. So this particular statement in verse 5 is merely to give us a glimpse of this. In Hebron, 7.5 years, in Jerusalem, 33 years. Now, obviously, here you add it up, it is 40 years and 6 months. In Hebrew, when it doesn't exceed, and run into the next year, it is still called 40 years, as in verse 4, right? This is 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 4. 40 years. 40.5 years is 40 years. It hasn't reached 41 years. That's basically how the Hebrew count the years. But what we're trying to say is this. When David is in Hebron, and then we have 7.5 years, sometime here after the second year, we have David made king over all Israel. That would be 2 Samuel 5, verse 1. And then from here on to the end, that would be 33 years. This would be in Jerusalem. And it just continues on. So all the statement in verse 5 is saying it is not excluding Israel when it was in Hebron. It was just not important. It's just to highlight the fact that it was Hebron and Jerusalem. These are the two important locations in verse 5. That's the focus. The rest of it, we have to try to piece together. And that's how I would suggest that we could piece together that sometime after the second year of Ishbosheth, 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1 took place. And then he reigned over all Israel, but without talking about it because it was not important. What is important in verse 5 is the location. So this would be my view of things. We look at chapter 5, verse 6. Now, chapter 5, verse 6. This one talks about a pair of passages in First Chronicles chapter 11, verses 1 to 9, I think, right? And it talks about now the king, that's David, and his men, they went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land. It talks about the inhabitants of the land because in Jerusalem, this is taken care of by the Jebusites. And so this would be part and parcel of a hill, right? A hill, part of the stronghold. And they said to David, and this is, I guess you could say that this is a very cocky statement, right? Very cocky statement. It is trying to explain to David that he has no ability of taking over Jerusalem. And so you shall not come in here. Because even those who are blind and those who are limping, they will turn you away. And they are saying that because they they think David cannot enter there. And so let me just put it here is that this is really mocking David. And they're saying that in the city, there are those who are blind and lame, right? Limping is lame. And these weaklings of the city can actually turn David away. And that's how arrogant the Jebusites were. And truly, nobody has been able to conquer the Jebusite stronghold yet until today. And so in verse 7, we read this. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. Now, understand that this city of David is a name given to a location. And I can safely tell you that this is the south of the Temple Mount, right? The whole idea here is the city of David was a peculiar and particular location where David is going to make it his very own. That's why it's called the city of David, David's city. And it will have David's character. And whatever David wants in the city, it will define the city because of David. That's what it means. But in verse 7, there's just a passing line that says, well, he captured the stronghold of Zion. And there's another hill by the side of Jerusalem called Zion. And the city of David is basically sitting on that hill. Now, if you continue reading First First Chronicles chapter 11, you find that when David said on the day, whoever strikes the Jebusite is to reach those who limp and those who are blind, who are hated by David's soul through the water tunnel. What is David really saying? Well, he is actually saying you have to go and kill the Jebusites. You have to take care of the limp and the blind, because the Jebusites are so arrogant that they could actually line up the blind and the limp, and they can actually defeat David. And so David's soul hates them because they are being used by the Jebusites to taunt David. And so David looks around, and being the master strategist, I would say, he looked at it and says, well, people who are blind and people who limp shall not come into the house. They cannot come in to the home of God, or the house of David, whichever that may be, because we're not quite sure the context of the house, but it could be the temple or it could be David's palace. But the idea here is the lame and the limp, right? The blind and the limp, it doesn't have a place in the Jerusalem that David is going to conquer. Although it is metaphorical in nature, we don't know that David actually had a person to do that. But I would say that when they speak of this, people who are blind, people who are limp, it basically lends credence to this, saying that when they are able to take Jerusalem, then they can say, where are the blind? Where are the limp? So this is part and parcel of the objective that David has to take over the Jebusite stronghold. Now, we are also told right here that there is a water tunnel. Now, what is a water tunnel? A water tunnel is actually a hollow, how would you say, a hollow water conduit. Basically, what happened now that we know the history is that the Jebusite stronghold is on a hill. And somewhere on the hill side is a location that is called the Gihon Spring. And the Gihon Spring actually pumps water up. It does pump water up. And with the Gihon Spring, we will find a shaft going in. With the shaft, that is this idea, the water tunnel. They will climb into the shaft where it only fits one person, and that one person will go in and, well, literally take care of the Jebusites to show them that they will have to eat their words. That's how important that would be, right? They have to eat their words. And so what we find here is we don't see the rest of the story, so we have to go to First Chronicles chapter 11, and there is nothing said here. What happens if the first person that went in and dealt the blow to the Jebusites, what will he get? And so First Chronicles chapter 9 said that it was Joab who did it, and he was made the leader of the troops. And so that would be a backstory that we can get in First Chronicles chapter 9, that it was Joab that actually took care of things for David. Now, a couple of chapters ago, we said that Joab was too anxious to seek revenge. And hence, whatever that may be, David did not execute him. And now uh, we have this particular story in First Chronicles chapter 11, where it was Joab who did it, right? It was Joab who did it. And so verse 8 basically says, who would be able to go up there, reach up to the water tunnel, and take over Jerusalem. And so when you take over Jerusalem, it will be as if the people who are blind and limp in the Jebusite city does not exist anymore. So I think it could be very much a symbolism or a euphemism of the mockery by the Jebusites. And David basically took over the Jebusite stronghold. Now, go back and read First Chronicles chapter 11, and you get a more details there. So David lived in the stronghold. Why is it a stronghold? It's got walls, and called it the city of David. And David built all around from the Millo onwards. Now the idea of the Millo, it is a, well, how should we say? It's a fortification. If we have a Temple Mount, and this is the Temple Mount, this would be the Millo, and this would be the southern part. And so David actually built on the Millo inward. And so this Millo has a wall, and he built a wall around it, and he built internally, right? He built internally. And so that would be the picture. David's very own city, very own city. And so whenever you read the word city of David or David's city, it really means Jerusalem. It doesn't mean anywhere else. Now, one of the things that happened is after the 7.5 years, David started to reign from Jerusalem. in the early part of chapter 5, it was still in Hebron when all the tribes of Israel came to him. Now has moved his headquarters from Hebron to Jerusalem. And without telling us very much, we see that he was becoming stronger and stronger. And Elohe Yehovah Tzavaot, right? Yehovah Elohe Tzavaot is the Lord God of armies. And the Lord God of armies will use these people to achieve his purposes. And now David is beginning to see that, wow, his army is getting stronger, the people have gotten stronger, and he feels good about it. That he says, yeah, I am successful too. And now he looks around him. Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees, carpenters, and stonemasons. And here, as I would say, a period where he started to reign in Jerusalem, he can see clear signs that he has grown in stature, grown in maturity, grown in power as God's army. Then Hiram, king of Tyre, where they have lots of cedar wood, came to pay homage. In 512, David then realized that the Lord had appointed him king over Israel, and he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people, Israel. So the idea here of realize, what goes on to your head? This word here, and then David knew. That's the important thing. David is now seeing events around him. And then one by one, we are told what events they are, right? What events they are. And so they see the events, and then he realized, wow, everything is coming together. God must be behind all this. And that's why he is a man after God's heart, because the first thing that comes to mind is, what about God? Right? That's a very close and intimate relationship. The Lord had appointed him as king over Israel. And that David, whatever may happen, will have to maintain a holy and a humble heart for all Israel. Now, verse 13 gives us another glimpse of this giant. Meanwhile, and then David took more concubines, wives from Jerusalem, meaning marrying the men and women in Jerusalem after he came from Hebron. So he's sitting in Jerusalem to be the next king. And more sons and daughters were born to David. Now we only have a glimpse, right? A shortened version of the family of David. But certainly there were more children born to David because of concubines and wives. For example, Hagar is a concubine. Bilhah and Zilpah were concubines, although they were called wives because they had sex with David. But in terms of the value that is contributed to this statement for our own information, is that in a very short line, it just tells us that David had more concubines, right? More concubines. These are concubines who, well, I guess they have uh they were able, right, to join into David's extended family. Wives, concubines is not free, bonded. Wives means free, not bonded. That's an accurate way. Not bonded. And so you find that he had more sons and daughters, and it came from a number of these concubines and wives. Now, we read earlier on that David had the lady from who is the widow of uh, uh, who is a widow. We have one who is a wife of another person from Jezreel. And so what happened is in the life of David, he is also very colorful, having initially two wives. Right, he had a wife, Milcah, that was given away, and then he married two wives, and he got Milcah back. And then when he got to Jerusalem, he had many more concubines and wives. Wives means free woman. Concubine means not free. Now, in verse 14, it merely enumerates to us the names of his children born in Jerusalem. The first one here is Shamuah, right? Shamuah. Next came Shovav, and then Nathan, and then Shlomo, right? Shlomo. Looking at this is another description of the children of David. This will be Yifchar. This is Elishua. This is Nepheg. This is Yapia. Next one is Eli Shama. Next one would be El Yada. And then the final one is Eli Phalet. And so what we find is even David has a role that he is very well versed. He's very conscious. He is not dropping into this role by chance. It is God who had put all these, I would say, approval that David will become king of all Israel. And so all of these is showing us that, yes, David is happy. He is having more and more children. And these are more children that we learn of in chapter 5, verses 14 to 16. With this, we come to the end of our session today. How is it that God was agreeable to man having more than one wife back then? Okay. How and when when and how come God later changed to one wife? All right. Let me give you the short version. The short version. There is really no clear and explicit statements in the Hebrew Bible that tells us that it is a law that God only wants a union of one man and one woman. We are told in Genesis chapter 2, verses 24, that it is always between a man and a woman because it is for the purpose of being fruitful and multiply. And as we go along in the book of Genesis, we begin to see that, even in Genesis chapter 4, there is an incident of a man with two wives. And then we begin to see that uh, it may be a cultural thing, as some scholars would suggest. And the reason being is that the lifespan of people are not very long. And so they need to have more children. And if they need to have more children, they need to have more than one wife. And the idea there would be that the wives would give birth to more children, and the sons generally die young because of the wars. Now, when you come to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you would find that even in Abraham's time, they have a culture whereby when the wife or the free woman is unable to give birth, uh, she would assign her born woman Hagar to Abraham, so that they 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 meaning Sarai could have a son through Hagar. But we know the story, right? It didn't work out. Now we find that Hagar would be known also as a wife in the sense of giving birth, but she is technically or legally a concubine because she is a bondwoman and does not share the same status with the free woman as wife. And we'll see this further on with Jacob. He had Leah and Rachel or Rachel. And then you have Bilhah and Zilpah, the two bondwomen, women who also gave birth. And then you get the 12 tribes of Israel because there were 12 sons. Now you find that this is a situation where it is a where God is absolutely silent and God doesn't talk about it. God doesn't forbid it. God doesn't say anything against it. And yeah, life goes on. You have it with Saul, then you have it with David, then you have it with Solomon, and so on and so forth. And so people in the old days do have many wives. And we read that when we were doing First Samuel. And Elkanah had two wives. And so we shouldn't be alarmed when we read the scripture this way, because, as I said up front, God did not explicitly forbid this. In fact, He did not oppose it. And I would leave this with you. According to a rabbinical tradition that was told to me, the Jews themselves had practiced polygamy for a long time until right around the time of the 10th century, where they began to travel back and forth. Now, one of the prohibitions in the book of Leviticus is that you're not supposed to marry your immediate family, all right? And if they had multiple wives in the same location, then the children would know each other and they wouldn't intermarry. But when they started to travel from town to town to do business and had a family in another town, the children themselves might, by perchance, cross path and violate the Torah. And in so doing, they introduced the prohibition of multiple wives to avoid uh, contravening the Torah, where the children unknowingly marry each other. And so the in Judaism, as I understand, they have this idea that if there is a rule, they would build a hedge around the rule so that they would not violate the rule. And so the rule here is you do not marry within the family. The siblings don't marry. And so they built a hedge around it to prevent this from happening. And the way to prevent this from happening is to adopt a monogamous marriage. Now, over time, the different nations of the world had adopted a one man, one wife policy. And so in our country, we have enacted that, uh, excluding it from the Muslims. And so this is very much a modern day concept. And it doesn't exist in the ancient times. And that would be my academic opinion.
So a man marrying another wife is not considered as committing adultery?
No. Adultery in the Hebrew Bible is defined as a man taking another man's woman, another man's wife. That would be constituting adultery. So our modern day definitions may not be quite accurate when it looks at the Bible. So I would suggest that when we look at the Bible, we should take the Bible's definition rather than our modern day English definition.
So, Pastor Karen, so the 10 Commandments, thou shouldn't have adultery, is actually not mentioning cannot have two wives because during that time it's already Moses' time, olden times.
Yes, exactly. So understand, let me just repeat that point. Adultery in the Hebrew Bible refers to a man taking the woman of another man. That is really like stealing, or it would be robbing. If it's taking the man's possession, or in this case, the woman, and God forbids that. And of course, God also equates that to idolatry as adultery, because God is illustrated as the man and Israel the wife. And as adultery, it would mean that the wife, Israel, goes after other men. And so other men takes the wife, and that is considered adultery. And so it is an abomination in the eyes of God when Israel goes after other gods. And that's the principle in the Hebrew Bible.
Are the concubines always a bonded servant?
Are concubines bonded servants? Good question. Yes. In principle, the concubines are not free women. Not free women means they don't belong to anyone. So a princess or a queen of another nation is a free woman, but a daughter of a bonded man is a bonded woman. And in those days, I guess you can also see that in ancient India, in ancient China, where the emperors had multiple wives and concubines. And concubines do not have the same status as a wife. So different places will have different definitions. I would say that technically speaking, generally you will find that concubines are not accorded the status of a legal wife, be it free or bonded, but generally they are bonded women.
So
the children of the concubines, would they be bonded in that case?
Well, in most cases, concubines are bonded, as we have seen, right? Zilpah, Bilhah, they are bond women. You find Hagar is a bond woman, all right? So can have many girlfriends as long as they are not somebody's wife. In the book of Deuteronomy, when a man has sexual relations with a woman who is not betrothed or a wife of another man, the consequence is that the man has to marry the girl. And so, yeah, you can have as many girlfriends that will become wives immediately.
For the case,
yeah,
the bonded concubine, is it always from the nations, from the Goyim? Because like Hagar or this, not
yes. you will need to understand in the land of Israel, you find that there are bonded tribes where they sell themselves because they are poor, and they are released again according to the Torah. I think it is 7 years, right?
Yes,
And so it is important for us to understand that yes, for the Israelites, they could be bonded, but generally you find that bonded women are from other nations. Yes.
So King David break the law twice, the commandment twice. The first time he took back his wife, and second time the one that he go and kill send the general to war. So this means twice he break the law, and in the commandment say you break one commandment, you break all.
You need to understand in the time we read this, I think a couple of chapters ago, where David told Abner that if you want to have a covenant, first bring me Milcah. So Milcah was rightfully his wife, and so he's just taking back his wife because it was Saul who actually removed Milcah and gave it to another man.
Oh, Milcah one was not sin, but the other one is sin, the one that Bathsheba.
With Bathsheba, no. When we get to Second Samuel chapter 11 and 12, we will deal with that issue. We will deal with that issue. It's not seen that way. Yes.
Thank you, Pastor.
Yeah.
Pastor, can
Yes.
you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just testing first. Wouldn't you just say that whatever man is doing apart from Genesis is a deviation from the original plan of God? You know, I mean to say that they can have many girlfriends. That's just those are just rules being allowed for in Deuteronomy to set them free from that kind of a sin or.
Oh no, not at all. We should not even see it that way. See, these are rules that God set for Israel. And God set the rules for Israel so that they can have a harmonious society. And so you're not supposed to go around taking somebody else's wife. And so that has a capital punishment, punishable by stoning. But if a man have, okay, in this case, you want to call them girlfriends, right? And the law tells us that the man is obligated to marry that woman. So there is no such thing as many girlfriends as modern day. When you have a girl that who is not married or betrothed, and you have sexual relations, the law says that you are to marry the girl. There is no, well, I guess you can say the law does not provide for hanky-panky.
But the law still provide for something, yeah.
The law allows for multiple wives because it's not against God's wishes. God's primary wishes is be fruitful and multiply. And so you can't have be fruitful and multiply when in a nation where you've got only one. And when men begin to die off from the war, as you can read in the book of Exodus, Numbers, what do we have? Deuteronomy, in the book of Joshua, Judges, and the book of Samuel, and they've been fighting back and forth, and men died. And so essentially what's going to happen is if they did not have many wives in that sense, then they won't have any more sons, and eventually the nation will die.
How can we reconcile the many wives, and the be fruitful and multiply with the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 17, where the king is, told not to multiply wives for himself?
Okay, first of all, understand in that passage, it is to the king, right? It's to the king. Because a king has absolute powers. And a king can have not 2 wives, not 3 wives, but have any number of wives. And so God is just laying down a guideline to tell him that don't do that. If you do that, there are certain consequences from doing that, right? So there is nothing to reconcile.
So is David not following God's Torah in this case, since he has multiplied wives?
No, the question is, what do you mean by multiply? How many is multiplied? So are you defining a number for David, or would it be for God to so decide? All I can say is the text there just says that you shouldn't have so many wives, and it's not a sin. Understand that.
Yeah,
It is something that you need to understand, that it is God's telling him that if you are going to be king, you need to run your country, guard my people. And if you have too many, I don't know how many is too many, that you will not be able to fulfill your role as a king. So that would be a challenge. The other thing is, you also should not have wives or concubines who are from the other nations, lest they would lead him to serve other gods. That was really the rule of not having many multiplying wives. Yeah. So don't read it. It's so specifically. It's not a general rule. It's very much for the king.
Yeah, that's why I said. I mean, in the case of King David, because this is about the Torah as specific to the king of the multiply.
Yes. So my question to you would be: did God punish David?
No, but it's just that.
Then I would leave it at that. So we don't need to go and inquire further, because it would be a situation between David and God.
Yeah. So
otherwise, we become the judge, and I don't think God would have made us that.
So in the Torah, for the king, it's not stated as to the number of wives that he can have, right? Because it said multiply. So in this case, David is not worried about the wives turning him away to worship.
No, not at all. The problem actually occurred with Solomon. So when we get to First Kings, then we will see that the effect of the multiple wives.
But it's like Solomon wouldn't know that the wives would turn him away.
No, I don't think we need to read so much into the text. So don't read. It's one challenge that we have when we read the Bible, is that we tend to think of all the permutations. The narrative in the Bible doesn't give us all the permutations, and as such, I myself would refrain from adding into the text. If it's there, it's there, and if it doesn't say, I wouldn't try to say any more than that. It is a temptation for many of us when we read the text, that we tend to want to know everything, but the text doesn't say it, and so I really would be cautious in that sense. Yeah.
I think we're trying to understand how God's law actually works.
Yeah, except for what God says. And when it comes to the New Testament, it is something else. And we know that even just looking at another person can be adulterous.
I think that
so it's something else.
A bit more explanation, because in the Hebrew law, we need to actually understand how that is applied, and whether that is a new rule. All right, that's whether it's a new rule. It appears that there's a new extended rule, but let me just wrap up this discussion, because we've crossed our time. The rule of God. And when God sets the law for Israel, it is really very much what God desires of Israel as a nation, as a society, as a people, to behave before God with regards to man and other men, and to God and what they are supposed to do. And so that's how they are to rule their lives, so that there could be a harmonious society. And it is to demonstrate that by following the rules that Israel can be a light to the nations, that the rest of the nation can see that, wow, this nation must have God in their midst. And so that was the purpose of God giving them the rule to govern them as a nation, because they are God's special people. So I would just leave it at that, as opposed to saying, oh, how does that apply? Because the judge of that would be themselves, since we are not the Jewish nation. We should not attempt to I guess, become their judge, if I can put it that way, and leave that to how they would govern themselves. But we can glean from the principles of how God set the rules, and perhaps that would aid us in our lives.